Hi there, this is Dr. Sami Garas. In this video, we will talk about the audit evidence and the process of auditing. As you remember, we say the auditing process starts by understanding the client and going into agreement with the client through the drafting of the engagement letter, which identifies the responsibilities and the authorities of the auditor and the management. And based on the engagement letter, the auditor will start his process by collecting some information about the industry of the client, about the client operation itself, and the internal control. Then the auditor will start to assess the risk in the audit process. And based on that, he will make a visit to the client to evaluate the internal control. And this is what we have discussed through the prior two chapters in the auditing process. And in this chapter, we will continue our discussion by talking about the audit evidence. If you remember, we say the stages of the audit start by planning the audit, assessing the risk of the audit. And this is what we discussed in the previous two chapters. And then here we'll start talking about the performance of audit procedures, which is covered in the audit evidence chapter. And then we talk about the completion of the audit and finally the evaluation of the whole audit before we express our opinion. So you need to know that the audit evidence falls in the third stage of the audit after the understanding and the evaluation of the audit internal control. If you remember in the previous chapter, we say, how can the auditor understand the audit? By making some narration, drafting flow chart, developing questionnaire, and then assessing the risk where we identified 3 levels of risk. The first and the easiest one is control deficiency, and we reported to the management. Significant deficiency, which we reported to the executive management and the audit committee. Material weaknesses, it's the severe level of risk, and we have to identify it and report it to the audit committee. And in this chapter, we will dive into the design and perform evaluation of test of control, where we will talk specifically about each one of those testing, like inquiry, inspection, observation, and reperformance. And then we talk about the substantive tests, which cover the trend analysis, ratio analysis, and reasonable test. So the key points that I will cover in this chapter, first, we will talk about 4 different decisions in the area of audit evidence. And then we will talk about the evidence and how it impacts the whole financial statement, which we call it persuasiveness. So persuasiveness of the evidence, it means the impact of the evidence on the financial statements as a whole. And then the type of evidence, the purpose of the audit documentation, which comes after we collect the evidence, preparation of the audit documentation, and finally, we submit our audit report. Before we go through the areas of evidence and audit documentation, I need to highlight the auditing standards that have been issued by PCAOB and AICPA that guides the auditor in collecting the evidence. The first one, PCAOB standard 1105, which is the audit evidence. This standard talks mainly about the sufficiency of the audit evidence, relevance, and reliability. And I'm going to talk about those 3 areas of sufficiency, relevance, and reliability in my presentation. But then it takes the auditor to address the area of the assertions that have been issued by the management. And then we'll start talking about each one of the elements in the area of test of controls and substantive tests, which I mentioned in my last slide. I got the information from this standard: inspection, observation, inquiry, confirmation, recalculation, re-performance, and analytical procedures. So you need to know from where we get this information. It's from the auditing standard. And then we talk about the selection of the items, the audit sampling, and this is what I'm going to address in the next chapter, where we talk about the area of audit sampling. And this is pretty much the standard of the PCAOB. The second standard, which is issued by AICPA, is more or less similar to the standard of PCAOB, which is the AU section 326, which also talks about the same area of audit evidence. And here it talks about the sufficiency, relevance, and reliability. So here we see sufficiency of the audit evidence. And then it talks about the reliability of the audit evidence, and then the relevance. And also it talks about the assertions of the management. And finally, it talks about all the audit procedures. We make it in the audit evidence. And here we talk about the inspection of the records, inspection of assets, observation, inquiry, and so on, confirmation, recalculation. So this can tell you that both PCAOB and AICPA address the guidelines that the auditor should follow when he starts working on the collection of evidence. So what are the 4 areas of audit evidence? First, the auditor has to address a key question: which procedures he should use to collect the evidence. And this is a key point, because if the auditor decides to make irrelevant procedures, the evidence will not be admissible. Second, when has the auditor to perform the procedures? Is it at the planning stage, or during the field work, or at the end? And this we call it reliability. So the first 2 decisions the auditor has to address is the item itself and then the timing. The other 2 regarding to the sampling, what the sample size and which items should be included in the sample when we collect the evidence. And here we address sufficiency. So when we talk about relevance, reliability, and sufficiency in the auditing standards, we talk about those 4 different items. Now we need to know how the evidence will impact the financial statement as a whole. We say sufficiency is related to the quantity of the evidence, reliability and relevance related to the quality. And here for the sufficiency, we need to address the size and the items. For the reliability, we talk about the decision of the nature and the source, and relevance relevant to a particular assertion. And then for the reliability, if we get the document or the evidence from the client, it's less reliable than when we get it from outside. So there are general evidence where we can get it externally or internally, obtain it direct by the auditor or through another party. Is it written or oral? Is there an effective internal control in the company's organization or not? These are general guidelines for the audit evidence. Second, the document independence. Is it direct from a third party? For example, if I ask the auditor, the client to give me the bank statement. If the client gives me the bank statement, it is document, it is in writing, but it's less reliable than getting the same statement from the bank itself. This one we call it third party. From third party held by the company, is it under control by the company or independent? The more independent the resource of the document, the more reliable it will be. Finally, legally, we talk about the primary and the secondary evidence, circumstantial or hearsay. So we need to know that when we collect the evidence, we need to keep in mind the reliability, which means should we trust the document or not? Well, it depends. If we get it from the client or we get it from another one, whether we get it oral or in writing. The reliability of the evidence depends on some characteristics. First, as I said, the independence of the provider, like the bank, like the customer of the client, or the supplier of the client. Second, the effectiveness of the client internal control. If we get any document from the client, we must check the internal control, because if the internal control system is weak, we will not trust any evidence we collect, regardless of how reliable this evidence. Then the auditor's direct knowledge of this evidence, the qualification of the individual providing the information. If we get an evidence, from whom did we get it? Did we get it from the secretary of the company, or we get it from the accounting manager? The qualification of the evidence adds more reliability to the evidence. Then the degree of objectivity. Is it in writing or is it oral? So the writing, it will be the more objective it will be. And then the timeliness. If we ask for the evidence, do we get it at the same time or we get it after 2-3 weeks? Because the longer the time gap, the less reliable the document it will be. Then the sufficiency of the evidence, as I said, it depends on the auditor's expectation of misstatement, the effectiveness of the internal control. Now let us talk about the types of evidence. What are the types of evidence? We say it depends on the test of control. If we trust the system, we make some test of control, like ask the management, which we call it inquiry, like inspection of the operation, observation of the environment, and reperformance. So we run those tests if we trust the internal control system. If we don't trust the internal control system, we make physical examination. So we have to examine all the assets, all the records. We make recalculation to the information. Again, we make confirmation. Confirmation, we send the request to the client or to the supplier or to the customer and get a feedback to the amount we mentioned in the confirmation to make sure whether it's correct or incorrect. A good example, when I get the accounts receivable record from the client, I pick some clients and I send them a request to confirm that the client number in the accounts receivable ledger is correct with them. If I receive a feedback from the customer, we call it confirmation from the customer. This is more reliable than the confirmation we receive from the client itself. And finally, the analytical procedures. So let us keep in mind those 8 items, and I'm going to guide you through all of them one by one in the coming slides. So let us remember, if we have good control system, we test it by making 4 items. If we have weak internal control, we make extra work to get the correct information. And here we have to keep in mind the audit standards that, we have to check the PCAOB standard and AICPA, where we check about the qualifications and conduct, the evidence accumulation and the reporting. And then we talk about the types of evidence here, physical examination, confirmation, and inspection. And then we make broad categories of evidence available for the auditor. And finally, we talk about the 4 decisions of the audit evidence, whether we talk about relevance, reliability, and sample size. I hope you find this briefing video is useful, and I will talk about the other points in another video.